Some mistakes we carry for a lifetime. Some chances we thought were lost forever. On a frozen Dakota morning in 1883, a broken cowboy stood at the door of the woman he left behind 20 years ago. Emmett Clay had nothing left but shame and an empty milk pail. Mara Hensley had every right to turn him away. But when their eyes met across that threshold, something neither time nor heartbreak could erase stirred between them. She filled his pail without a word. Then she did something that changed everything. She touched his hand. Could two souls, scarred by years of loneliness, find their way back to each other before winter's end? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dakota Territory stretched out in every direction like a gray wool blanket thrown over the bones of the earth. November wind cut across the high plains with a voice that sounded almost human, moaning through the coulees and rattling the bare branches of the few cottonwoods that had managed to take root near the creek beds. It was the kind of cold that found its way through every layer of clothing, past leather and wool, and even hope, settling deep in a man's marrow, where it would stay until spring, if spring ever came. Emmett Clay felt that cold more keenly than he had in his younger years. At 53, his body remembered every hard season, every cattle drive that went wrong, every night spent sleeping on frozen ground when better men had warm beds. The lines in his face were cut deep, like gullies carved by decades of rain, and his hands bore the permanent stains and calluses of a life lived outdoors. His beard, more grey than brown now, did little to protect his weathered face from the wind. He rode a horse he'd borrowed 3 towns back, a gelding with ribs showing through its winter coat, and between his thighs he held an empty milk pail, dented tin that caught the weak afternoon light. He'd practiced what he might say for the last 5 miles, rehearsed it in his mind until the words lost all meaning. In the end, he knew there weren't words enough in the English language to account for 20 years of absence. 20 years since he'd seen her face. 20 years since he'd made the choice that hollowed out the center of his life and left him drifting like tumbleweed across the territories. The Hensley place appeared first as a thin column of smoke rising against the steel sky, then gradually resolved into a homestead carved from the stubborn earth. The cabin was small but well-maintained, built from logs chinked tight against the weather. A barn stood nearby, its roof patched in places but solid. Split-rail fencing marked out pastures where a dozen cattle grazed, their breath steaming in the cold air. Chickens scratched in a yard near the house, and he could see a vegetable garden plot, bare now but clearly tended. It was the kind of place a man could be proud to call home, the kind of place Emmett had never let himself build. He dismounted slowly, his knees protesting. The worn leather saddle creaked as he pulled the milk pail free from where he'd secured it. It was the only reason he could give himself for being here, the only excuse that didn't require him to speak the deeper truth. A man could ask for milk without explaining his whole life. A man could stand at a door with an empty pail and not have to say that he'd emptied himself out just as thoroughly over the years. The cabin door was painted blue. He noticed that detail with the strange clarity that comes when a man's heart is beating too fast. Blue like summer sky, though he couldn't remember if it had been that color before. Before, there was a whole life contained in that word. Before the war. Before he'd left. Before he'd decided he was too damaged, too haunted, too broken to deserve her. He'd made it as far as the porch steps when the door opened. Mara Hensley stood in the doorway, and for a moment neither of them moved. Time did something strange then. It folded in on itself, so that he was seeing both the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. She was 50 now, he calculated. Her dark hair, pulled back in a practical bun, showed threads of silver at the temples. Her face had thinned some, the softness of youth replaced by the strong lines of a woman who'd learned to carry weight. But her eyes, those eyes were the same deep brown he'd memorized back when the world was younger, and he'd believed he had a right to happiness. She wore a simple dress, dark blue calico under a heavy shawl, and her hands, he noticed her hands gripping the doorframe, were work-roughened. The hands of someone who'd learned to do for herself what she couldn't pay others to do. On her left hand, no ring, but on a thin chain around her neck, visible at the collar of her dress, he could see the glint of gold, a ring worn close to her heart instead of on her. Finger, Emmett. She said his name like she was testing whether it still fit in her mouth after all these years. Mara. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended, scraped raw by more than just the cold. I know I got no right to be here. She didn't contradict him, didn't rush to make him comfortable with easy forgiveness. She just stood there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, though she'd have been entitled to that. Not joy either. Something more complex, layered like sediment at the bottom of a river. That your horse? She asked finally, her gaze moving past him to the borrowed gelding, standing with its head down. Borrowed. I'll return him when I can. And the pail? He lifted it slightly, feeling foolish. I was hoping, that is, I wondered if you might spare some milk. I can work for it. I'm good with livestock still. Can mend fence, chop wood, whatever needs doing. A gust of wind swept across the porch, and Mara pulled her shawl tighter. She studied him for a long moment, and he forced himself not to look away. He owed her that much, to let her see what the years had done to him, to let her measure the cost of his choices written in the lines of his face. You look half frozen, she said at last. And that horse looks worse. Put him in the barn. There's hay and some grain. Then come inside. We'll talk about milk and whatever else needs saying. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. A beginning, maybe, or at least not an ending. Emmett nodded, not trusting his voice, and turned toward the barn. The interior was warmer than outside, heated by the presence of the animals. 2 milk cows, some chickens roosting in boxes, and a mule that regarded him with suspicious eyes. Everything was orderly, well kept. He unsaddled the gelding and rubbed him down with a handful of straw before measuring out grain. His own saddle he set carefully in a corner. Old leather, cracked and stained, but maintained with the care of a man who owned little and valued what he had. It had been with him through more miles than he cared to count, through cattle drives that made fortunes, and drives that ended in disaster. Through years when he'd had a purpose, before the purpose had worn thin and left him with nothing but forward motion and regret. When he finally approached the cabin door again, he paused with his hand raised to knock. Through the window, he could see Mara moving about inside, stoking the fire, setting something on the stove. The scene was so domestic, so peaceful, that he felt like an intruder even before crossing the threshold. This was her life, built without him. She'd married someone else, Hensley, the name suggested. Had a home, maybe children grown and gone now. A whole existence that continued just fine in his absence. He knocked. "It's open," her voice called. Inside was warmth and the smell of coffee and something baking. The cabin was single-roomed with a sleeping loft, but it was arranged with care. A wood stove dominated one corner, radiating heat. A table with 2 chairs sat near the window. Shelves lined one wall, holding dishes, preserves in jars, books. A rocking chair near the fire had a quilt draped over it. The bed in the corner was neatly made. Everywhere he looked, he saw evidence of a life lived with attention and intention. Mara was pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. She set one on the table and gestured for him to sit. He did, wrapping his cold hands around the cup and feeling the warmth seep into his fingers. "Jacob died 3 years ago," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. "Pneumonia. Went quick, which I suppose was a mercy. We were married 15 years. He was a good man, steady, kind, never raised his voice or his hand. He worked this land until it yielded, and when he died, he left me with a home and a chance, which is more than many women get." Emmett absorbed this information, feeling each word like a stone dropped into still water. Jacob, a good man. The man who'd gotten to wake up beside her for 15 years, while Emmett had been, where? Sleeping under stars, working other men's cattle, drifting from Montana to Texas and back again, never settling, because settling meant admitting he'd made the wrong choice. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, because what else could he say? "Are you?" She met his eyes directly. Sorry he died or sorry he existed in the first place? The question was sharp but fair. Sorry he died, Emmett said after a moment. Any man who was good to you deserves to be mourned. As for the rest, I got no right to be sorry about choices you made. I gave up that right when I didn't come back from the war. You did come back. I heard about it. You made it home in '65, same as plenty of others. You just didn't come back to me. There it was. The thing that needed saying. Emmett set down his coffee cup and looked at his hands, those scarred, weathered hands that had held reins and ropes and rifles, but never again what he'd most wanted to hold. I was different after, he said quietly. The things I saw, the things I did, I came back wrong, Mara, broken in ways that don't show on the outside. I had dreams that woke me up screaming. I had rage in me that came out of nowhere. I'd see blood that wasn't there, hear voices I wasn't fit for the life we'd planned. The house, the family, the future. I would have dragged you down with me, so you made that choice for both of us. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the hurt underneath, old but not healed. Decided what I could handle. Decided I was better off not knowing, not choosing. Just gone. One letter saying you needed time and then nothing. 20 years of nothing, Emmett. I know. He couldn't look at her. I know I wronged you. I thought I was doing right, saving you from a man who wasn't whole anymore. But I know now I was just a coward, afraid you'd see what I'd become and realize you'd been waiting for someone who didn't exist anymore. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Mara rose and went to the stove, checking whatever was baking there. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. You think you're the only one who came back different from hard times? You think life out here doesn't break people down and change them? Jacob and I, we lost 2 babies, both in the first year. I buried them on that hill behind the barn, and there were days after when I didn't want to get out of bed. Days when the world seemed too sharp and too hard, and I didn't see the point of going on. But I did, because that's what you do. You carry what you have to carry, and you find reasons to keep walking. She pulled a pan from the oven, cornbread, golden and steaming. She cut 2 pieces and brought them to the table with butter. The gesture was automatic, the hospitality ingrained despite the conversation's weight. I'm not saying what you went through wasn't real, she continued. War changes men? I've seen it. But you didn't give me a chance to decide if I wanted to help you carry it. You just left. And I had to make a life anyway. Had to choose to survive instead of waiting. Emmett accepted the cornbread, still too full of shame to feel much hunger, but knowing to refuse would be an insult. He broke off a piece, the steam rising, and tried to find words that weren't just more excuses. You're right, he said, about all of it. And I got no defense, except to say I've regretted it every day since. Carried you with me everywhere like a weight I deserved to bear. Never married because it seemed wrong to promise anything to anyone else when I'd broken the only promise that mattered. I don't expect forgiveness, Mara. I don't expect anything. When the last cattle drive went bad and I ended up here with nothing, I couldn't make myself ride past. Couldn't face another winter alone without at least seeing if you were all right. She was quiet for a time, eating her cornbread, sipping her coffee. Outside, the light was fading toward evening, and the temperature was dropping. He could see her thinking, weighing, deciding. The milk, she said finally. I'll give you milk. And you can stay in the barn if you need a place for the night. It's too cold to send a man back out in the dark, even a man who probably deserves it. But come morning, you'll need to decide if you're staying to work or moving on. I can use help around here. There's more work than one person can manage. But I won't have you here out of guilt or obligation. If you stay, it's because you choose to, knowing there's no going back to what was. No pretending 20 years didn't happen, I understand. And he did. She was offering him something. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but maybe a chance to do something right for once. To be useful instead of just sorry. She poured milk from a pitcher into his pail, the white stream catching the lamplight. When the pail was full, she set it on the table between them. They both looked at it for a moment, this simple thing that had brought him to her door. Then Mara did something that made Emmett's breath catch. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his, just for a moment, just a touch. Her skin was warm from the coffee cup, and he could feel the calluses on her palm, the strength in her fingers. "It's good you came," she said quietly. "Whatever else is true, it's good not to spend another winter wondering." She withdrew her hand, rose, and began clearing the table. Emmett sat still, feeling the ghost of that touch like a brand. After 20 years of punishing himself, of believing he deserved nothing but loneliness and regret, that simple gesture cracked something open inside him. Not hope exactly, he had no right to hope, but possibility. The smallest, most fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't require him to keep carrying the past like stones in his pockets. "I'll stay," he said. "If you'll have me. I'll work hard and I won't presume. Won't expect anything beyond what you're willing to give. But I'll stay." Mara nodded, her back to him as she washed the dishes in a basin. "Then you'll need blankets. There's extra in the chest. And Emmett," she turned to face him, "we'll talk more. About what happened, about what didn't, about Jacob and the war and all of it. Not tonight, but soon. If we're going to do this, we do it honest." "Honest," he agreed. "I owe you that much." As he made his way back to the barn through the gathering darkness, the milk pail heavy in his hand, Emmett felt something he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. Not happiness. That seemed too large a word, too presumptuous. But perhaps relief. The relief of finally, after 20 years of running, coming to rest. Of standing still long enough to face what he'd done and who he'd become. The barn was cold but dry, and he made himself a bed in the hay using the blankets she'd given him. As he lay there listening to the animals settle for the night, he thought about that touch, her hand on his. It hadn't been romantic or forgiving. It had been something simpler and somehow deeper, acknowledgement. She'd seen him, really seen him, and hadn't turned away. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of snow. Winter was coming to the Dakota territory, as it always did. But for the first time in 20 years, Emmett Clay would face it not alone, but with a roof over his head, and the possibility, however distant, of redemption. He pulled the blankets close and closed his eyes. And for once, the dreams that came were not of war, but of mourning, of work to be done, and coffee to be shared, and a woman whose hand had touched. His with something that felt almost like grace. The blizzard came that night like a wolf descending on prey, swift, fierce, without mercy. Emmett woke to the sound of wind screaming through the gaps in the barn walls, and when he opened the door to check the sky, the snow hit him like a fist. The world had disappeared into white chaos, visibility reduced to nothing. He could barely make out the shape of the cabin, though it stood less than 50 yards away. He fought his way through drifts already knee-deep to pound on Mara's door. She opened it quickly, her hair down around her shoulders, a heavy robe pulled tight. "I need to check the cattle," he shouted over the wind. "Make sure they're not drifting. You'll get lost," she shouted back. "Can't see your hand in front of your face out there. Can't let them drift. They'll pile up in a coulee and freeze." She studied him for a hard second, then nodded. "Rope, tie one end to the porch, other end around your waist. At least you can find your way back." It was smart thinking, the kind that came from years of surviving plains winters. He waited while she retrieved a coil of good hemp rope from inside, then secured one end to a porch post and the other around his middle. The wind tried to tear the barn door from his hands when he opened it, but he got inside and checked the animals. The cattle were pressed together in one corner, their body heat creating a pocket of relative warmth. The horses and mule were fine, but he could hear something banging, metal on wood, irregular and violent. The barn door on the north side had torn partially loose. Every gust of wind slammed it against the frame, and if it came completely free, the storm would pour in, and the animals would scatter into the killing cold. Emmett grabbed a hammer and nails from Jacob's tool belt hanging on a post, the leather worn smooth by another man's hands, another man's work. No time to think about that now. Getting the door secured meant working outside, in the full force of the wind. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and the snow was coming horizontal, sharp as needles, against exposed skin. His fingers went numb almost immediately as he wrestled with the door, trying to hold it closed while driving nails. The wind fought him for every inch. Twice he lost his grip, and the door slammed open, nearly taking him with it. He didn't know how long he worked. Time became meaningless, reduced to the simple repetition of nail, hammer, trying to secure the hinges and add a crossbrace. His whole world narrowed to that single task, fingers that couldn't feel anymore, lungs burning from breathing frozen air. Finally, the door was solid. He'd reinforced it enough that it would hold through the night. But when he turned to make his way back to the cabin, following the rope, his legs wouldn't quite work right. The cold had worked deeper than he'd realized, and his body was starting to shut down, prioritizing his core at the expense of his extremities. He pulled himself hand over hand along the rope, stumbling through drifts that seemed determined to hold him. He made it to the porch, got the door open, and nearly fell through it. Mara caught him, her strength surprising, and kicked the door shut behind him. She was talking, but he couldn't make out the words over the ringing in his ears. His hands looked wrong, waxy white, no feeling. His feet were blocks of ice in his boots. "Emmett, can you hear me?" "Stay with me now." Her voice came through clearer. He nodded, tried to speak, but his jaw was locked tight with shivering. She was already moving, efficient and practiced. Got his coat off, his boots, the wet socks beneath. Wrapped blankets around him, and guided him to sit in the rocking chair she'd pulled close to the stove. The fire was built high, almost too hot, but he couldn't stop shaking. "Don't warm up too fast," she said, her hands checking his fingers, his ears, his nose. "A frostbite sets in, you'll lose pieces. Nice and gradual, that's how we do it." She brought him water to sip, not hot, but room temperature, and made him drink slowly. She rubbed his feet with firm strokes, forcing circulation. The feeling coming back was agony, pins and needles that graduated to fierce burning. He groaned despite himself. "I know," she said. "I know it hurts. That's good, though. Means the tissue's alive. The cattle," he managed through chattering teeth. "To hell with the cattle right now. You nearly died out there for some cows that probably would have been fine anyway. Had to fix the door." She paused in her ministrations and looked at him. Really looked at him. "The barn door was loose?" He nodded. "North side?" Another nod. "Then yes," she said more softly. "You had to fix it. Storm like this, that door comes off, I'd lose everything in there." She went back to working on his feet, but her touch was gentler now. "But you're a damn fool all the same. Could have waited till morning. Morning might have been too late, and you might have frozen to death. Then what good would you be?" It was a fair question, though he didn't have a good answer. He'd acted on instinct, saw a problem, fixed it. Didn't stop to weigh the cost. Maybe that was part of his problem, always had been. Acting without thinking about consequences. Doing what seemed right in the moment, without considering who else might pay the price. As the hours passed and the storm raged outside, Emmett's body gradually returned to something approaching normal. The violent shivering subsided into occasional tremors. The pain in his extremities faded to a dull ache. But the exhaustion that followed hypothermia was profound, pulling at him like a current. Mara made coffee and soup, and he ate obediently, tasting nothing but grateful for the warmth. She'd wrapped more blankets around him until he looked like a cocoon, and the chair was positioned so close to the stove he could feel the heat radiating against his face. "You can't go back to the barn tonight," she said. It wasn't a question. "Storm's not letting up. You'll sleep here by the fire. I'll take the bed. You'll do as you're told, just this once. I didn't spend 3 hours keeping you alive just to have you freeze on the walk back to the barn." He didn't have the strength to argue. As she banked the fire and turned down the lamp, he caught a glimpse of her in profile, the strong line of her jaw, the way her hair caught the last of the light. She looked tired, but not fragile. Capable, self-sufficient, a woman who'd learned to survive without anyone's help, including his. In the darkness, with only the glow of the stove for light, she spoke again. "Jacob died in winter. Went out to check on a cow, having trouble calving. Got wet, got cold, and I couldn't warm him up fast enough. By morning, he was burning with fever, and 3 days later he was gone. Emmett heard what she wasn't saying, the terror she must have felt tonight, watching history try to repeat itself. A man going out into the cold for the sake of livestock, not coming back right. The helplessness of trying to warm someone when the cold had already dug its claws in too deep. "I'm sorry," he said, "for making you relive that. You didn't know. But now you do. So next time there's a storm, you ask before you go out there. You plan, you prepare, you don't just charge into it thinking stubbornness will see you through." "Yes, ma'am." A long silence followed. Then so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "I'm glad the door's fixed, though." "And I'm glad you made it back." He wanted to respond, to say something that would acknowledge the weight of that admission, but she was already moving away, climbing the ladder to the sleeping loft. He heard the ropes of the bed creak as she settled in, then nothing but the storm outside and the pop and hiss of the fire. Emmett lay in the nest of blankets, feeling the warmth seep back into his bones, and thought about the strangeness of the day. He'd started it as a man with nothing but an empty pail and a shameful request. He'd end it lying on the floor of the woman he'd abandoned, alive only because she'd fought to keep him that way. The circle of it felt meaningful somehow, though he couldn't quite trace the pattern. Through the window, when the wind shifted, he could glimpse the barn, solid, secure, ready to weather the storm. Inside would be Jacob's tools, Jacob's work, the legacy of a man who'd done right by Mara when Emmett had chosen wrong. He'd used that dead man's hammer tonight, borrowed his practical wisdom, stepped into a role that should have been his if he'd had the courage to claim it 20 years ago. But Jacob was gone. And Emmett was here, and the barn door was fixed. Small things, maybe. Not enough to balance any scales. But it was something, a start. The first payment on a debt so large he'd never see the end of it. But that didn't mean he shouldn't try. The storm blew itself out 3 days later, leaving the world transformed beneath 3 feet of snow. When Emmett finally walked back to the barn on the morning of the 4th day, his legs still weak but functional, he found the animals safe and the north door solid. Above it, barely visible beneath the snow that had drifted against the wood, he could see his repair work, new boards crossing old, nails driven true. Not pretty but strong, the kind of work that would hold through winter and beyond. He ran his hand over the wood, feeling the rough grain beneath his palm, and made himself a promise. Whatever else happened, whatever Mara decided about him staying or going, he would leave this place better than he found it. Would fix what needed fixing, mend what needed mending. It wasn't redemption. He wasn't fool enough to think salvation came through good deeds. But it was purpose. And that was something he hadn't had in longer than he cared to remember. Inside the cabin, he could see Mara moving past the window. She'd saved his life. The debt now ran both ways, his old betrayal, her recent grace. How they'd balance that accounting, he didn't know. But for the first time since riding up to her door with his empty pail, Emmett allowed himself to believe there might be a way forward that didn't end with him alone. The days that followed the blizzard settled into a rhythm that felt both strange and familiar. Emmett woke before dawn in the barn, the hay still holding enough warmth from his body that rising wasn't pure misery. He'd dress in the dark, pull on his boots, and make his way to the cabin where Mara would have coffee already brewing on the stove. They'd drink it mostly in silence, the companionship of shared warmth rather than words, then set about the day's work. There was always work. Winter on a Dakota homestead didn't mean rest. It meant survival. The cattle needed hay forked out to them twice a day. Ice had to be broken on the water troughs each morning, sometimes twice when the temperature plunged. Fences required constant checking because a cow could smell a weak point the way a man could smell coffee, and they'd push through given half a chance. Wood needed splitting, and there was never enough wood. The chickens needed tending, eggs collected, the barn mucked out. Each task led to another, in an endless chain that would break only when spring finally arrived. Emmett worked until his back ached and his hands were raw, despite the gloves Mara had found for him. He worked past the point where younger men would have stopped for rest, driven by something more than duty. It was as if every fence post he reset, every bucket of water he hauled, was a word in a conversation he didn't know how to have otherwise. An apology written in labor, a promise made with hammer and nails. Mara watched him those first days with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not suspicion exactly, but wariness. The look of someone who'd learned not to count on things lasting. She'd direct him to tasks in the morning. The south fence needs attention, or the wood pile's getting low, and he'd nod and do them. In the evening, she'd feed him supper, good plain food that stuck to his ribs, and they'd talk about surface things. The weather, the cattle, small practical matters that didn't require excavating the past. He was aware always of Jacob's presence in the place. Not ghostly, nothing so dramatic. But the dead man's hand was everywhere, in the way the tools were organized in the barn, each in its proper place. In the clever solution to water drainage behind the house that kept the foundation dry. In the strong fence corners that had been built to last. Jacob Hensley had been a man who thought ahead, who built things right the first time. Emmett found himself studying those details, learning from a man he'd never meet. Jacob's tool belt hung on the same post where Emmett had grabbed it that first night. Good leather, worn soft by use, the kind of wear that came from years of honest work. Emmett used the tools, but always returned them to the belt, never presuming to claim them as his own. They weren't his. This wasn't his place. He was here on borrowed time, borrowed grace, and he tried not to forget it. On the 6th day after the storm, neighbors arrived. Emmett was splitting wood when he heard the jingle of harness and the crunch of snow under runners. A sleigh pulled up to the house, carrying a man, a woman, and a young fellow who looked to be in his middle 20s. The man was stocky and ruddy-faced, the woman thin and bird-like, the younger one tall and fair-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been truly tested by the world. Mara came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "Sarah, Tom, this is a surprise. Came to check on you after that blow," the man, Tom, said. "Roads are finally clear enough to make the trip. Brought some bread Sarah made, and Thomas here was worried about you managing alone." The young man's eyes had found Emmett, standing there with the axe in his hands, clearly not a casual visitor. His expression went through several changes: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been disappointment. "I'm managing fine," Mara said. "This is Emmett Clay. He's helping out with the winter work." Emmett Clay. Tom's eyes narrowed as he worked through memory. "And the name's familiar." "It's been a long time," Emmett said, setting down the axe and approaching. "I knew Mara before the war." Before... Understanding dawned on Tom's face, and with it a certain coolness. "I see. Well, it's fortunate you happened by when you did." The words were polite, but the tone said something else. It said, "We've been looking after Mara. Where were you?" It said, "You're an interloper here, an outsider." It said things that Tom Caldwell was too mannered to speak directly. But that came through clear enough in the set of his shoulders. And the way his son was looking at Emmett, like he'd stolen something precious. "Tom." "And Sarah owned the place 3 miles west," Mara said, her voice carefully neutral. "They've been good neighbors. Thomas here has been kind enough to help with some of the heavier work since Jacob passed." "Happy to do it," Thomas said, still looking at Emmett. "Anytime you need anything, Miss Mara, you just send word." "I can be here in half an hour." "I appreciate that, Thomas." "I surely do." Mara's tone was warm but not encouraging. The distinction was subtle but there, and Emmett saw Thomas register it with a slight tightening around his eyes. Sarah had been studying Emmett with frank curiosity. "Will you be staying on, Mr. Clay?" "Through the winter?" "That depends on Miss Hensley. I work for my keep, nothing more." "Nothing more," Sarah repeated, and there was a world of speculation in those 2 words. "Well, it's good Mara has help. Place is too much for one person. We've been saying so since Jacob died. They didn't stay long. Accepted coffee but declined Mara's invitation to lunch, claiming they needed to check on their own place before dark. But before they left, Thomas found a moment alone with Emmett by the woodpile. "I've been looking after Miss Mara for 3 years," he said quietly, "since her husband died. Making sure she's safe, helping with the work she can't do alone. I've been patient, respectful, waiting for a proper time to speak my mind about certain matters. "I'm not here to interfere with anyone's prospects," Emmett said. "Aren't you? Because it seems to me a man doesn't show up at a widow's door after 20 years for no reason. And it seems to me a woman might let old feelings cloud her judgment about what's good sense and what's just sentiment." Emmett met the younger man's eyes. Thomas wasn't wrong to be concerned. By any practical measure, he was the better choice. Younger, established in the community, clearly willing. Emmett was just a drifter with nothing but regrets and a worn-out body. "Miss Hensley's judgment is sound," Emmett said finally. "Whatever she decides about anything, it'll be because it's what she wants, not because anyone clouded anything. And if she wants you to speak your mind about those certain matters, I expect she'll let you know. Or maybe she's just being kind," Thomas said. "Letting an old man winter here out of pity doesn't mean anything beyond that." Maybe it didn't. Emmett couldn't argue the point because he didn't know himself what it meant, his being here. Whether it was kindness or something else, whether his staying served any purpose beyond giving him a place to be useful before he died. After the Caldwells left, Mara was quiet through supper. Emmett didn't press. He'd learned over the years that silence was sometimes the most respectful gift you could give someone, the space to think without having to explain themselves. But as he was pulling on his coat to head back to the barn, she spoke. "Thomas is a good young man. Hard-working, honest. He'd make someone a fine husband. I don't doubt it, but he's not what I want." She said it plainly, without decoration. "I had a good marriage. I know what that feels like. And I know what I felt with Jacob was different from what was before. Not less, just different. Steadier maybe, safer." Emmett waited, sensing there was more. "I don't know what this is," she continued, gesturing between them. "Having you here. I don't know if it's wise or foolish, if I'm being kind or just revisiting old ghosts. But Thomas, assuming he has some claim that his patience entitles him to something, that's not right either." "No," Emmett agreed. "It's not, so we'll figure it out as we go. You'll keep working, I'll keep feeding you, and we'll see what there is to see. Fair enough?" "More than fair," she nodded, satisfied, and turned back to cleaning up the supper dishes. Emmett stepped out into the cold night, his breath fogging in the air, and looked up at the stars scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on dark cloth. The wind had died down, leaving a stillness that felt almost peaceful. In the barn, he made his bed in the hay and lay listening to the cattle shift and sigh. Through the gaps in the walls, he could see lamplight in the cabin window, Mara's shadow moving behind the glass. A woman sorting through her own thoughts, making her own choices. Not his to influence, not his to claim. Just there, nearby, real in a way nothing had felt real to him in longer than he could remember. He thought about Thomas Caldwell's words. Old man wintering here out of pity. Maybe that's all it was. But even if true, it was more than he deserved, and he'd take it. Take whatever time and grace she was willing to give, and try to be worthy of it. Try to leave things better than he'd found them, even if he couldn't repair everything he'd broken. The tools on Jacob's belt gleamed faintly in the moonlight coming through the window. Good tools, well-maintained, ready for the next task. Emmett closed his eyes and promised himself he'd honor them. Honor the man who'd built this place and loved this woman when Emmett had been too much a coward to do the same. Tomorrow, there would be more work. More fence, more wood, more of the endless tasks that kept survival possible on the plains. And he'd do them, one after another, building something he couldn't yet name, but could perhaps eventually deserve to be part of. December wore on with the slow, deliberate pace of cold seasons. The sun rose late and set early, and the work compressed into the narrow hours between darkness and darkness. Emmett's body adjusted to the rhythm, waking, working, sleeping, until the days blurred together in a pattern that felt almost meditative. His hands grew accustomed to the tools. His muscles remembered the old motions from cattle drives and ranch work done decades ago. The soreness that had plagued his first weeks eased into a manageable ache. He was in the cabin one afternoon, helping Mara move a heavy trunk so she could retrieve something from behind it, when he noticed the Bible on the shelf. Plain black leather, well worn. She'd mentioned it in passing days before, referencing a particular passage about patience. He'd meant to look it up, curious what specific words had stayed with her through the years. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the book. "Of course." He pulled it down, feeling the weight of it, and opened to where she'd indicated. The pages were thin as onion skin, marked here and there with penciled notes in a careful hand. But as he turned to the passage, something fluttered out and fell to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, then froze. Wildflowers, pressed flat, their colors faded, but still recognizable. Purple aster and yellow coneflower, the kind that grew on the Dakota plains in summer. He knew these flowers. He'd picked them himself a lifetime ago, walking with Mara through the tall grass before everything changed. His hand trembled slightly as he held them. They were impossibly fragile, these remnants of a summer day in 1862 or 63. 20 years they'd lain here, preserved between the pages of scripture, kept safe when logic said she should have burned them or thrown them away. Mara had gone still across the room. When he looked up, she was watching him with an expression that held both defiance and vulnerability. "They were too pretty to throw away," she said, but her voice gave lie to the casual words. "Just flowers. They were never just flowers. No." She came closer, took the Bible from his hands, looked down at the pressed blooms. "You picked them the day you asked me to wait for you. Said when you came back from the war, we'd have a whole field of them at our wedding." The memory was sharp as broken glass. He'd been 21, full of righteous purpose and naive certainty. The war would be brief, they'd said. He'd go serve his country and come home a man worthy of her. They'd marry in the summer, have children, build a life. Simple plans, the kind young people make when they think the future is something they can control. "I should have burned them," Mara continued, "after the first year with no word. After I married Jacob, after he died, and I had to sort through all the pieces of my life and decide what to keep and what to let go. I took them out a dozen times, meant to throw them in the fire. But I couldn't." "Why?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because they were real. Whatever else happened, whatever you decided or I decided, that day was real. You loved me then, I know you did. And I loved you. Sometimes I needed to remember that wasn't made up, wasn't something I'd imagined. Even if it didn't last, it was real while it lasted." Emmett felt something crack open in his chest. All these years he'd carried the weight of his abandonment, the guilt of his choices. But she'd carried something too. These flowers, this proof that she'd once been loved by a boy who'd made her promises. That she'd been worth promises, even ones that got broken. "I never stopped," he said quietly, "loving you. I told myself I had, convinced myself it was kinder to forget. But I never did." "That's hard to hear, Emmett. Because if you loved me, how could you stay away? How could you let 20 years pass?" "Because I loved you. Because I was broken and you deserved whole. Because every time I thought about coming back, I'd remember waking up screaming, or the way my hands shook when the memories got bad, or the rage that would come out of nowhere. I thought that was love, protecting you from what I'd become. That was pride," she said, not unkindly. "Pride dressed up as sacrifice. You decided what I could handle. Decided you weren't good enough. Decided for both of us," he couldn't argue. She'd said it before, and it was true. But now, standing in her cabin holding evidence that she'd kept part of him close all these years, the truth felt larger than his ability to contain it. "If I could go back," he started. "But you can't. None of us can. We only get to go forward, if we're lucky." She took the flowers gently from his hand and placed them back in the Bible, closing it with care. "I kept them because I needed to remember I'd been young once, that I'd felt things deeply. That before Jacob and widowhood and hard winters, there was summer and wildflowers, and a boy who looked at me like I was something precious. You were. You are, and you're here now," she said. "So maybe we stop talking about what was and what should have been, and start figuring out what is." That evening, they sat at the table going through Jacob's ledgers. Mara had spread out the farm accounts, and the news wasn't good. The numbers told a story of declining resources and mounting pressures. The banknote would come due in April, $500, a sum that might as well have been 5,000 for all their ability to pay it. Jacob took out the loan 3 years ago, Mara explained. Needed to replace the barn roof and buy breeding stock. He meant to pay it off gradually, but then he got sick. The first year after he died, I used what savings we had to make the payment. Last year I sold some cattle, got enough to cover it. But this year, she gestured at the columns of figures. Income from eggs, butter, a few cattle sold. Expenses for feed, supplies, the endless small costs of keeping a farm running. The gap between the two was stark. How much short are we? Emmett asked. $230. He did the mental calculation. They had 3 months until the note came due. 3 months to somehow conjure $230 from frozen ground and thin cattle. We could sell some early, he suggested. Take whatever price we can get. Winter prices are terrible. I'd have to sell 8 head to make up the difference, and those are breeding cows. I sell them. I'm mortgaging the future to pay for the present. What happens if we can't pay? The bank takes the farm. I'd have 60 days to leave. Emmett looked at the neat columns of Jacob's handwriting, the careful accounting of a man who tried to build something lasting. All that work, all those years, could be erased by 3 bad seasons and an unpaid debt. There has to be a way, he said. If there is, I haven't found it. Believe me, I've looked. They worked through scenarios, selling this, cutting that, finding markets for butter or eggs or anything else they could produce. But winter limited options. Nobody needed much butter when the cold kept everything fresh. Eggs were seasonal. The cattle were too thin from winter feeding to bring good prices. As the evening wore on and the lamp burned low, Emmett became aware of how close they were sitting, heads bent over the same ledger, his shoulder nearly touching hers. The domestic intimacy of shared problems, shared calculations. This was what he'd given up, not just her company, but this partnership. The daily working through of life's challenges together. At one point, their hands brushed while reaching for the same page, and neither pulled away immediately. Mara's fingers were ink-stained from the pen, warm despite the room's chill. Emmett felt the contact like electricity, the simple touch carrying weight disproportionate to its duration. "I'm glad you're here," she said suddenly. "Not because you can solve this, I don't think anyone can, but because it's less lonely working through it with someone. I wish I had answers. You're here. That's something." Later, walking back to the barn through snow that squeaked underfoot in the deep cold, Emmett turned over the problem in his mind. $230. A fortune to people like them. But there had to be a way. Some solution he wasn't seeing yet. In the barn, he lit a small lantern and sat on a hay bale thinking. His eyes fell on his saddle in the corner, the one possession of value he still owned. Good leather, well maintained despite the years. It had been with him through everything. Worth maybe $30 to the right buyer, but $30 wasn't $230. He thought about his years of drifting, the cattle drives, the ranches he'd worked. He'd been good at what he did before age slowed him down. His reputation, back when he'd had one, had been solid. Men had trusted him with their stock, their investments. An idea began to form, half wild but possibly workable. If he could connect with the right people, make the right arrangements, but it would require leaving, going to the territory capital, making deals, putting himself forward in ways that felt dangerous after so many years of moving through the world like a ghost. The risk wasn't just failure. The risk was that if he left, even with good reason, even with the intention to return, Mara might see it as history repeating. Another promise, another leaving. Some patterns cut too deep to escape. He lay back in the hay, the lantern casting shadows on the barn walls, and made his calculations. 3 months until the payment came due. Time enough to try if he was careful, if he was lucky, if he could find a way to help without breaking the fragile trust they were building. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and persistent. Winter still had a long way to run, but spring was coming eventually. And with it either salvation or loss. Emmett closed his eyes and tried to see a path forward that didn't require him to choose between being useful and being present, between solving her problems and respecting her agency. The pressed flowers in the Bible had survived 20 years. Perhaps, with care and intention, something else could survive too. Something new, built not on the ashes of what was, but on the honest foundation of what remained. Christmas arrived with clear skies and temperatures so cold the snow crunched like broken glass underfoot. Emmett woke on Christmas morning to find Mara had already been to the barn, leaving fresh bread and a thermos of hot coffee on the workbench. A small kindness, but it touched him more than lavish gifts would have. She'd thought of him, considered his comfort, cared enough to make the cold walk before dawn. He found her at the cabin, dressed in her good dark dress, a heavy shawl around her shoulders. A basket sat on the table packed with what looked like a simple meal. "I always visit Jacob on Christmas," she said without preamble. "It's become my custom. You're welcome to come along if you want. Or you can stay here, keep the fire going. Either way's fine." "I'll come," Emmett said. "If that's all right." They walked together up the hill behind the barn, following a path that had been worn into the snow by previous visits. The grave was on a rise that looked out over the prairie, marked by a simple wooden cross and a border of stones. "Jacob Hensley, 1828-1880, beloved husband." The words were carved deep, still clear, despite 3 years of weather. Mara set the basket down and stood quietly for a moment. Emmett hung back, not sure what his role should be here, not wanting to intrude on private grief. But she turned and gestured him closer. "Jacob," she said, speaking to the grave as naturally as if the man could hear, "this is Emmett Clay, the one I told you about from before the war. He's helping with the winter work." It was strange being introduced to a dead man, but there was something right about it too. Jacob deserved to know who was using his tools, sleeping in his barn, sitting at his table. "He was a good man, your husband," Emmett said, addressing the grave directly. "I can see it in everything he built, how he cared for things. For her, I'm grateful to him for that. For giving her the life I couldn't." Mara's breath caught slightly, but she didn't speak. They stood there in the cold silence, 3 people, 2 living, 1 dead, connected by complicated threads of love and loss and time. Finally, Mara opened the basket and took out a small cloth bundle. Inside were ginger cookies, the kind that filled the cabin with spice smell when she baked them. She set several on the headstone, a Christmas offering. "Jacob had a sweet tooth," she said. "Always said my ginger cookies were better than his mother's, though I never believed him. But every Christmas I bring some, just in case he's watching somehow." She looked at Emmett then, really looked at him. "He knew about you. I told him early on, before we married. Said I'd been engaged once, to a soldier who never came back. He asked if I still loved you, and I told him the truth I didn't know. That I'd loved who you'd been, but that person was gone, and I couldn't spend my life loving a memory. That was wise. It was honest. And Jacob appreciated honesty. He said he'd take whatever parts of my heart I could give him, and he'd try to make them grow. And he did. He was patient with me, kind, never jealous of a ghost, never made me feel like I had to forget you to be fair to him. He was a better man than most, than you." She asked directly. Emmett considered the question. "Yes, better than me. He stayed, he built. He gave you 15 years of steady partnership. I ran away and gave you 20 years of nothing. And yet he knew," Mara said quietly, "that if you ever came back, I might not be able to turn you away. We talked about it once, toward the end when he knew he was dying. I told him he was being foolish, that you'd been gone too long, that even if you did show up someday it wouldn't matter. But he just smiled and said some things root too deep to ever fully pull out." She pulled an envelope from her pocket, weathered and creased. "He wrote me a letter the week before he died. I found it in his desk drawer, with instructions not to open it unless you came back. I thought it was nonsense. Why would you come back after all those years? But he insisted, made me promise." Emmett's heart hammered in his chest. "You opened it? After you showed up, yes. Want to know what it said?" He wasn't sure he did, but he nodded. Mara unfolded the letter carefully, the paper soft with handling. Her voice was steady as she read, "My dear Mara, if you're reading this, then the cowboy finally came home. I can't say I'm surprised. Men like that, they drift for a long time, but eventually they come back to what matters. Don't send him away on my account. I had you for 15 good years, and that's more than some men get in a lifetime. You gave me everything you had to give, and I was grateful every day. But I always knew part of you lived in some place I couldn't reach, some room you kept locked. If he's the key to that door, then use it. Life's too short and too hard to spend it halfway. Love him if you want, or send him packing if you want, but do it because it's your choice, not because you think you owe my memory something. You don't. You gave me enough. Now give yourself whatever comes next. Your loving husband, Jacob. The silence that followed was profound. Emmett felt something tight in his throat, making it hard to breathe. Jacob Hensley had released her from obligation, given his blessing to whatever might happen. It was a generosity Emmett couldn't fathom, a grace he'd never earn. He was too good for this world, Emmett managed. No, Mara said firmly. He was just good. The kind of good that comes from choosing to be decent every day, even when it costs something. The kind of good you could be too, if you stopped punishing yourself long enough to try. She folded the letter and returned it to her pocket, then looked at the grave. Thank you, Jacob, for everything, for the years we had, for this last gift. I hope wherever you are, you're at peace. They walked back down the hill in silence, but it was a different silence than before. Something had shifted, some weight had been redistributed. When they reached the cabin, Mara stopped at the door. I'm going to make Christmas dinner, she said. Nothing fancy, chicken and potatoes, some dried apple pie. You'll eat at the table, not in the barn. It's Christmas, and I won't have you alone out there when there's food and company here. I don't want to presume. You're not presuming. I'm inviting. There's a difference. Dinner was simple but good, the kind of meal that reminded Emmett of other Christmases, other homes, before he'd made himself permanently homeless. They ate by lamplight, and afterward Mara brought out Jacob's pocket watch, the one thing of his she'd kept close. He'd have wanted you to have it, she said, holding it out. He wasn't much for sentiment, but he kept good time. Emmett took it carefully, feeling the weight of it in his palm. The watch was well made, reliable, the kind a working man would carry. When he opened it, the mechanism was clean and precise, ticking steadily. On the inside of the case, an inscription, to Jacob, with love and hope, Mara, 1865. I can't take this. You can, and you will. Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. But you need a way to tell time, and I have no use for it. Besides, her voice softened, I think Jacob would like the idea of his watch helping you, helping us. He was practical that way. Emmett closed the watch and slipped it into his pocket, feeling the weight of it like a talisman. Two men, both of whom had loved the same woman. One who'd died doing right by her, one who'd shown up too late with empty hands. And somehow, impossibly, the dead man had made room for the living one. Later, as evening fell and Emmett prepared to return to the barn, Mara asked the question he'd been dreading. Why did you marry Jacob? He'd asked it clumsily, but she seemed to understand what he meant. Why Jacob and not some other man? Why marry at all when she'd been waiting? She took her time answering, pouring them both more coffee, settling into her chair by the fire. Because I was 27 years old, and everyone I'd loved before the war was either dead or gone. My parents died of fever. My brother died at Gettysburg. You disappeared into silence. I was alone, Emmett, and the loneliness was consuming. Like drowning on dry land. Jacob was kind. He made me laugh. He didn't try to replace what I'd lost, but he offered something new, partnership, companionship, a future that wasn't just waiting. I understand. Do you? Because I need you to really understand. I didn't marry him because I couldn't have you. I married him because I chose to. Because he was there, and he was good, and I was tired of living in the past. I loved him, Emmett. Maybe not the same way I loved you, that first burning kind of love that young people feel. But I loved him steady and true, and I'd do it again. I'm glad, Emmett said, and meant it. Glad you weren't alone. Glad someone treated you the way you deserved. And you? She asked. In 20 years there must have been someone. No one who stayed, by their choice or yours. Mine mostly. There were women here and there. I'm not claiming to be a saint, but nothing that lasted beyond a season or a town. I told myself I was being honorable, not inflicting my damaged self on anyone. But the truth is I was afraid. Afraid of being known. Afraid someone would see what the war had done to me and decide I wasn't worth the trouble. That's cowardice and self-pity mixed together. It is, he agreed. And I'm not proud of it. But that's what I was. A coward who dressed his fear up as sacrifice. Mara stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness where snow had begun to fall again. We can't get back those 20 years, Emmett. Can't undo what was done or not done. But maybe we can start from here, from now. Two people who've made mistakes and carried losses and somehow ended up in the same place at the same time. I'd like that. Then that's what we'll do. But honestly, Emmett, no more deciding things for both of us. No more running because you think you know what's best. If we do this, whatever this becomes, we do it as equals. Partners. Like Jacob said in his letter, it's my choice. But I need you to make it yours too. To choose to stay, not out of guilt or debt, but because you want to be here. From his pocket, Emmett drew out his own watch, the one he'd carried for 20 years. Stopped at 3:47. He held it out so she could see. This stopped the day I left you, he said. The exact moment. I never wound it again. Kept it as a reminder of what I'd done, the choice I'd made. I've carried it every day since. He opened the case and began winding the stem, feeling the mechanism catch and engage. The watch started ticking, a small sound but steady. I'm winding it now, he said, starting the time again. That's my choice. To be here, to stay, to try to be the man I should have been all along. Mara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Then we'll start the time together, see where it takes us. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the prairie in white. Inside, the fire burned warm, and two people who'd loved and lost and found each other again sat in companionable silence, listening to the tick of a watch that had finally, after 20 years, begun to keep time once more. January came in mean and stayed that way. The temperatures dropped so low that thrown water froze before hitting the ground, and the wind carried a bite that went straight to the bone. Snow piled in drifts that reshaped the landscape into strange, sculpted forms. The work became a matter of basic survival, keeping the animals alive, keeping themselves alive, maintaining the thin margin between continuation and disaster. They were snowed in for nearly a week straight in mid-January, unable to make the trip to town for supplies. The cabin felt smaller with two people in it, the walls pressing close. They rationed the coffee, made meals from stores that were running low, and tried to give each other space in quarters where space didn't really exist. It was during those long days, trapped together by weather, that Emmett finally showed her the letters. He'd kept them in his saddlebag all these years, bundled in oilcloth to protect them from weather. Dozens of letters, some just a few lines, others running to several pages. All written, none ever sent. He brought them to the cabin on the third day of being snowed in, when cabin fever was starting to make them both restless. I wrote to you, he said, setting the bundle on the table. After the war and well for a long time after. Never mailed them. Didn't seem right when I'd already made my choice. But I wrote them anyway. Needed to somehow. Like talking to you even when I'd given up the right. Mara looked at the bundle, then at him. You want me to read them? I want you to understand what I was thinking all those years. Why I stayed away. You don't have to. I know it's asking a lot. But if we're going to be honest, you should know. She picked up the bundle, untied the string that held it together. The letters were arranged in rough chronological order, the dates scrawled on each envelope. She started with the first, dated October 1865. I'll read them, she said. But give me time. This is a lot. Over the next days, Mara read while Emmett worked on small repairs around the cabin, things that could be done inside. He mended harness, sharpened tools, fixed a chair that wobbled, gave her space to process what he'd written years ago. He watched her face sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. Saw anger flash across her features, then sadness, then something he couldn't name. She cried over some letters, her shoulders shaking silently. Others made her laugh, brief, bitter sounds. Some she read twice, going back to passages as if trying to decode meaning he'd hidden even from himself. The first letter was short. apologetic. He'd written about needing time to sort himself out, about the nightmares and the way loud noises made him hit the ground. He'd promised to come back when he was whole again. The second letter, 6 months later, revealed he'd started drifting, working cattle drives. Said he was getting better, learning to manage the dreams. Still thought he'd come back soon, but the third letter, a year after the war, showed the first real cracks. He'd written about a friend from his unit who'd killed himself, unable to live with the memories. About his own dark thoughts, the way he'd wake up with his hands around his own throat, trying to strangle the man he'd become. He'd written, "I'm poison, Mara. I'd poison everything I touch. Better to let you think I'm dead than to come back and show you what I really am." The letters continued, year after year. Some went months between writings. He'd chronicled his wanderings. Montana, Wyoming, Texas, Colorado. Described the work he did, the places he saw, the way he kept moving because staying still meant thinking too much. He'd written about seeing couples in town, families, wondering what their children would have looked like. Admitted he'd almost bought a ticket back more than once, got as far as the station platform before his courage failed. Later letters showed a kind of resigned acceptance. He'd convinced himself he'd made the right choice, that Mara had moved on and forgotten him, that his suffering was appropriate penance for abandoning her. The self-loathing in those pages was palpable, and reading them years later, he could see how he'd built a prison out of guilt and called it nobility. On the 5th day, Mara finished the last letter. She set it down carefully and sat staring at nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was controlled, but he could hear the emotion underneath. "You were suffering. I can see that reading these. The pain was real, it was. But Emmett," she looked at him directly, "you made yourself the center of your own story. Your pain, your unworthiness, your decision about what I could handle. In all these letters you never once asked what I might want, what I might need. You decided I was better off without you, and that was that. I know. Do you? Because reading these, I see a man so wrapped up in his own torment that he couldn't see past it. Couldn't see that maybe I was suffering too, that maybe I needed you, broken or not, that maybe being broken together would have been better than being whole and alone." The words hit hard because they were true. He'd been selfish in his self-sacrifice, had used his pain as an excuse to avoid the harder work of actually showing up and being present. "You're right," he said. "I was a coward, and I dressed it up as protection. I made it about keeping you safe from me when really I was just afraid of being seen as less than what I was, afraid of failing you. So I failed you in a different way, one that let me pretend I was being noble. And these later letters," she gestured at the pile, "where you talk about me being happy without you, about me forgetting. That was just you telling yourself stories to make your choice easier to live with. You didn't know if I was happy. You never asked." "No, I didn't." Mara stood and paced the small room, her movements tight with emotion. "I'm angry, Emmett. So angry I could—" She stopped, took a breath. "But I'm also sad. Sad for both of us, for all the years we lost, for what we could have had if you'd been braver. If I'd been, I don't know, more insistent. If I'd come looking for you instead of waiting. That's not on you, isn't it? I made choices too. Chose to marry Jacob, chose to stop waiting. I could have searched harder, but I didn't. I accepted your silence and built a different life. So we're both complicit in this, both responsible for the years apart." She came back to the table, picked up one of the letters at random. This one from 1873. "You wrote about seeing a woman who looked like me in Cheyenne. Said it hurt so bad you had to leave town that same day. If it hurt that much, why didn't you come find me? Because I was stupid. Because I believed my own stories about being better off alone. Because by then, I'd been running so long I didn't know how to stop. And now I'm here. Now I've stopped running. Now I'm asking, not asking, if there's any way forward that doesn't require us to pretend the past didn't happen." Mara sat down heavily. The letters spread across the table between them. "You never gave me a choice, Emmett. You decided for both of us. That's what hurts most. Not that you struggled, not that you were broken, but that you took away my right to decide if I wanted to help carry it. I was wrong. I can't say it enough times or loud enough, but I was wrong. Yes, you were. She reached across the table and took his hand, her grip firm. But you're here now, and I'm choosing, my choice, to let you stay. Not because I've forgiven everything, not because those years don't matter, but because holding on to anger and might-have-beens won't give us back what we lost. It'll just cost us what we could still have. Emmett felt his throat tighten. What could we still have? I don't know yet. Maybe just partnership. Two people working the same land, building something practical. Maybe more, if we can figure out how to trust each other again. But whatever it is, we do it honest. No more letters you don't send. No more deciding things alone. We talk, we argue if we need to, but we don't hide. I can do that. I want to do that. Then we start from here, from now, with all the broken pieces and all the mistakes. We put them on the table, and we figure out what we can build from what's left. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the cabin walls. But inside, something had shifted. The air felt clearer somehow, lighter. They'd said the hard things, faced the old wounds, not healed them. Healing would take longer than a few conversations. But acknowledged them, brought them into the light where they could be examined and dealt with. That night, before Emmett went out to the barn, Mara stopped him. "Thank you," she said, "for the letters, for letting me see what you were thinking, even if I don't agree with all of it. It helps to understand, even when understanding doesn't fix anything. I'm sorry for all of it. For every choice I made that hurt you, I know you are. And I'm sorry, too, for marrying Jacob without ever knowing if you were alive or dead. For not fighting harder to find you. For giving up. You didn't give up. You survived. There's a difference." She smiled, sad but genuine. "Maybe we both survived, just in different ways. And maybe now we get to do more than just survive. Maybe we get to actually live. I'd like that." After he'd gone, Mara gathered the letters and tied them back into their bundle. She'd keep them, she decided, not as weapons or evidence of wrongdoing, but as history. Proof of what had been lost, what had somehow improbably been found again. In the barn, Emmett lay in his haybed and listened to the wind. He felt scraped raw, exposed by the day's conversations, but also somehow cleaner, as if a wound that had been festering for 20 years had finally been opened and drained. It would leave a scar, some things did, but scars were better than infection. Scars meant healing had happened, even if it happened slow and left its mark. He pulled Jacob's watch from his pocket and checked the time by the light of his small lantern. Nearly midnight. The watch ticked steadily, reliable and true, keeping time for a man who'd finally stopped running from it. Tomorrow would bring more cold, more work, more small steps toward building something neither of them could quite name yet. But they'd take those steps together, honest about the ground they stood on, clear-eyed about the distance still to cover, and that, Emmett thought, as sleep finally pulled at him, was a better start than he had any right to expect. Better than he deserved, maybe. But given freely by a woman who'd learned the hard way that some things, forgiveness, trust, the possibility of love, couldn't be earned through penance alone. They had to be chosen, offered, accepted with open hands and honest hearts. He closed his eyes and let himself hope, just a little, that the offering would be enough. February brought a thaw that was almost cruel in its brevity. 3 days of temperatures above freezing that turned the snow to slush and filled the air with false promise of spring, before winter clamped down again harder than before. But those 3 days allowed the roads to clear enough for travel, and that's when the land agent came. Emmett was working in the barn organizing feed when he heard the wagon pull up. He looked out to see a man in a city suit, picking his way through the mud, carrying a leather case. Official business, then. Nothing good ever came from men in suits carrying official papers. Mara met the agent at the door. Emmett stayed in the barn but kept watch, ready to intervene if needed. He saw them talk, saw Mara's shoulders stiffen, saw her gesture emphatically. The conversation went on for maybe 15 minutes before the agent tipped his hat and returned to his wagon. When the wagon had disappeared down the road, Emmett crossed to the cabin. He found Mara sitting at the table, her face pale, a paper clutched in her hands. "What is it?" "The Swenson place," she said, her voice tight. "Next property over. It's been foreclosed. Bank's selling it. The Swenson place was a good piece of land, maybe 80 acres, with a decent barn and a small house. The Swensons had been trying to make a go of it for years, but last fall they'd given up and moved back east. Emmett had heard the story from Mara. Too much debt, too many bad seasons, not enough capital to weather the storms. "Who bought it?" he asked. "That's what the agent came to tell me. New owner wanted me to know, as a courtesy to a neighbor." She looked up at him, and he saw something in her eyes he couldn't quite read. "You did. You bought it, Emmett. Your name is on the deed." For a moment he couldn't process what she was saying. Then memory clicked. A day in early December when he'd ridden to town alone, ostensibly for supplies. He'd stopped at the land office, asked about available properties. The clerk had mentioned the Swenson foreclosure, said the bank was asking $300. Emmett had gone straight to the bank with his saddle and his horse, sold them both, along with what few possessions he had of any value. Walked away with $317. Just enough to buy the land and pay the filing fees. He'd planned to tell Mara, had meant to explain that he wanted to give her the land, combine it with hers so she'd have enough acreage to make a real profit, enough security that one bad season wouldn't destroy her. But the timing had never seemed right, and then the weeks had passed, and he'd told himself he'd wait until the papers cleared, until it was official. "Let me explain," he started. "Explain what?" Her voice was cold, in a way he'd never heard before. "Explain how you went behind my back and bought land without telling me. Explain how you made a major decision that affects my life without consulting me." "I was trying to help." "The land would have gone to someone else, probably someone who'd try to absorb your property too, push you out. This way I can deed it to you, expand your holdings, give you the security to weather whatever comes. You can deed it to me." She stood, the chair scraping harsh against the floor. "How generous! How noble! You swoop in and save the helpless widow with land she didn't ask for. Bought with money you didn't mention having. Making decisions about my future without bothering to see if it's what I want. Mara, do you hear yourself? Do you hear how you just did exactly what you promised not to do? You decided what was best for me. You decided I needed saving. You decided, Emmett, just like you decided to leave 20 years ago, just like you decided to stay away. You keep making decisions for both of us and calling it help." The truth of her words hit like a physical blow. He'd done it again, acted on instinct, on the desire to fix things, without stopping to consider that maybe she wanted to be consulted, that maybe partnership meant more than just good intentions. "I'm sorry," he said, but the words felt inadequate. "I thought the banknote is due in 2 months. You need $230. I thought if I could expand the farm, give you more resources, you'd have a better chance. And where exactly did you get $300? Her eyes narrowed. "You said you came here with nothing. I sold my saddle. My horse, everything I had, everything." She stared at him. "Emmett, that saddle was all you owned. That horse, how are you planning to leave if you don't have a horse?" "I'm not planning to leave, but you might need to. Circumstances change. And now you've trapped yourself here with no means to go anywhere else. You've made yourself dependent on me by trying to make me dependent on this gesture I never asked for." She wasn't wrong. He'd backed himself into a corner, made it so his only option was staying. Whether that had been subconscious or intentional, he couldn't say. But it revealed something about his thinking that made him uncomfortable. "I wanted to help," he said quietly. "I wanted to give you something, some security, some proof that I was serious about staying, about being useful. I don't need proof, Emmett. I need partnership. I need someone who respects me enough to ask before making decisions that affect my life. You say you've changed, that you've learned, but here you are doing the same thing you did 20 years ago. Deciding what's best for me without giving me a voice. You're right." He sank into a chair, feeling the weight of his mistake. "You're absolutely right. I thought I was past this, thought I'd learned to do better. But the pattern runs deeper than I realized. Mara paced the small room, her movements sharp with anger. The worst part is that it's a good idea. Combining the land makes sense. Having that buffer from whoever might have bought it, that's smart. But you should have talked to me first. We should have figured it out together. Found a way to raise the money together, or decided together if it was worth trying. I know. Do you? Because this isn't just about land, Emmett. It's about respect, about treating me like an adult who can make her own decisions. Jacob never... She stopped, took a breath. Jacob would consult me on everything. Every purchase, every decision about the farm. He valued my opinion, made me feel like a partner, not a ward to be managed. The comparison to Jacob stung, but it was fair. Jacob had apparently understood something Emmett still struggled with, that loving someone meant trusting them to make their own choices, even when you thought you had a better solution. I'll undo it, Emmett said. I'll go back to the land office, see if I can reverse the sale. Or I'll find another buyer, someone you trust. Whatever you want. That's not... Mara stopped, frustration evident in every line of her body. You're still doing it. Still trying to fix things by making decisions. I don't want you to undo it. I want you to understand why what you did was wrong. I want you to see that this isn't about the outcome, it's about the process. Then help me understand. Tell me what I should have done. She came back to the table, sat down heavily. You should have told me you were thinking about it. Said Mara, I have some money saved. The Swenson place is available. Should we consider buying it? Does it make sense for the farm? No, you should have made it a conversation, not a surprise. I thought I was being romantic, maybe. Grand gesture. Grand gestures are fine when they're about flowers or jewelry. Not when they're about land and property and decisions that affect someone's livelihood. This isn't romance, Emmett. This is my life. He sat with that, feeling the truth of it settle into his bones. He'd been operating from a playbook that was decades out of date, trying to be the hero of a story that didn't need one. Mara didn't need rescuing. She needed a partner who would stand beside her, not in front of her. I've spent 20 years imagining how I could make things right, he said slowly. Built up this whole idea of redemption through grand actions. But redemption doesn't work that way, does it? It's not about the big dramatic gestures. It's about the daily choice to do better, to listen, to respect. Yes, her voice was softer now, some of the anger bleeding into sadness. It's about showing up day after day and doing the small things right, asking instead of assuming, including instead of deciding, being present instead of trying to fix everything. I don't know if I can do that. Not naturally. It's not how I'm wired. Then you learn. You practice. You make mistakes and apologize and try again. But you don't get to use "it's not how I'm wired" as an excuse to keep hurting people, even when you mean well. The silence between them was heavy with things said and things still unspoken. Outside, the sun was setting, turning the snow-covered prairie gold and pink, beautiful and harsh at the same time, like so much in this life. Finally, Mara spoke again. The land is bought. That's done. And you're right that it makes sense to combine the properties. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to town together, to the land office, and we're going to put both properties in both our names. Equal partnership, legal and binding. If we're doing this, we do it right. Not you giving me something, but us building something together. You do that. After what I just did, I'm angry, Emmett. Furious, actually. But I'm also practical. And I'm willing to believe you can learn, if you're willing to try. This is your chance to show me you mean what you say about partnership. That you can take a mistake and turn it into something better. Equal partnership, he said, testing the words. Both names on the deed, both names, both voices, both votes on every major decision. And if you ever make another choice like this, without talking to me first, I'll throw you off the property myself, understand? I understand. She stood, moved to the window. We'll go to town next week when the roads are better. Get the paperwork done properly. And Emmett, she turned to look at him. This is your last chance. I mean that. I've given you more grace than you probably deserve. I won't keep doing it if you can't learn from this. I will. I promise I will. Promises are cheap. Actions matter. Show me. After she'd dismissed him to the barn, Emmett sat in the cold darkness trying to process what had happened. He'd meant well, that was the hell of it. Every instinct had told him he was doing the right thing. But meaning well wasn't enough, had never been enough. The road to hell, as they said, was paved with good intentions and poor execution. He'd wanted to be her savior, her protector, wanted to make up for 20 years of absence with one grand gesture. But she didn't need a savior. She needed a partner. Someone who would ask, "What do you think?" before acting. Someone who valued her judgment as much as his own impulses. It was a harder role to play than hero. Required more humility, more patience, more daily discipline. But if he wanted to build something real with Mara, something that would last, he'd have to learn it. Had to rewire decades of thinking that put his judgment first and called it protection. The deed sat in his pocket, paper that represented both his best intentions and his worst blind spots. Tomorrow they'd make it right, turn his unilateral decision into their shared future. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was a step, another chance to do better, to be better. To learn that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures, it was about respect. About listening, about trusting the person you love to know their own mind and make their own choices. Even when, especially when, those choices might not be what you'd choose for them. He pulled out Jacob's watch and checked the time by moonlight. Still ticking, steady and true. Still keeping time for a man who was learning, slowly and painfully, what it meant to be worthy of the gift he'd been given. The watch, the woman, the second chance he'd never expected and didn't quite deserve. But maybe if he could learn fast enough and well enough, he'd grow into deserving them. Not through dramatic acts of sacrifice, but through the quiet daily work of being a man someone could trust. Someone who asked before deciding. Someone who listened before acting. Someone who finally, after all these years, understood that partnership meant walking side by side. Not 3 steps ahead, trying to clear the path. The week that followed the land revelation was cold in more ways than one. Mara was civil but distant, speaking to Emmett only when necessary, conducting their interactions with the formal politeness of strangers. He gave her space, did his work, and tried not to think about how easily he'd managed to damage what they'd been building. They made the trip to town on a clear Saturday morning, the wagon loaded with butter and eggs to sell. The road was hard-packed snow, frozen solid in the morning cold, and the journey took 3 hours. They sat side by side on the wagon seat, bundled against the wind, saying little. The silence wasn't companionable. It was the silence of 2 people who'd said too much and now didn't know how to find their way back to easier conversation. At the land office, they filed the new deed. Both properties registered to both names, equal partnership, as Mara had insisted. The clerk looked surprised but said nothing, just processed the paperwork and took their signatures. Walking out, Emmett felt strange holding a document that made him officially a landowner. He'd drifted for so long without roots that the weight of property felt foreign. "It's done," Mara said as they climbed back onto the wagon. "We're partners now, legal and binding." "Thank you," Emmett said, "for trusting me with this. After what I did, don't thank me yet. Show me it was the right choice." They made stops at the general store for supplies, at the feed merchant for seed grain they'd need come spring. Each transaction Mara conducted with brisk efficiency, and each time she asked Emmett's opinion, "Does this price seem fair? Or do we need more fence wire?" Making a point of including him in decisions. He recognized it as both genuine partnership and a lesson in how things should work. And he tried to learn from it. As they were loading the last of their purchases, Thomas Caldwell appeared, leading his horse down the street. He saw them, and his expression went through several changes before settling into careful neutrality. "Miss Mara, Clay." He nodded to each. "Heard about the Swenson place. Congratulations." "Thank you, Thomas," Mara said. "Must be nice having a partner for that kind of decision." There was something pointed in his tone. "My pa and I were considering making an offer, but we heard it sold quick. Didn't even know it was available yet." "It happened fast," Mara said, and left it at that. Thomas studied them both for a moment. "Well, good luck with it. That's a lot of land for 2 people to manage. You'll need help come spring, you let me know. We'll manage." Emmett said quietly. But we appreciate the offer. After Thomas had moved on, Mara sighed. That'll be all over the county by tonight. Everyone will know we bought land together. Does that bother you? No, yes, I don't know. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. People will talk. We'll assume things. Some will think it's too soon after Jacob, or inappropriate, or any number of things people think when they've got nothing better to do than mind other folks' business. I'm sorry. I've made things complicated for you. Life was already complicated, Emmett. You just added a different kind of complication. She snapped the reins, and the horse started forward. But it's my life, my choice. Let them talk. On the ride home, as the afternoon wore toward evening, Mara began to thaw slightly. She pointed out landmarks, told stories about the area, shared bits of local history. It wasn't the easy conversation they'd had before the land incident, but it was something, a beginning of a beginning. What will we do with the Swenson house? She asked. It's small but serviceable. We could use it for storage, or I could live there, Emmett said carefully. Give you your privacy back. Be close enough to help with the work, but not underfoot. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you want? I want whatever makes sense. Whatever you're comfortable with. Stop asking what I'm comfortable with and tell me what you want, Emmett. He took a breath. This was part of learning, stating his own desires, not just deferring to hers. I want to be close, want to share meals and conversation, and the work of building this place. But I also don't want to presume. Don't want you to feel like I'm pushing for something you're not ready to give. What am I not ready to give? The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had directly addressed. They'd been dancing around it for weeks, the question of what they were to each other now. More than employer and hired hand, more than old acquaintances renewing connection. But how much more and in what configuration remained undefined? I don't know, Emmett admitted. That's for you to say. You tell me what you're ready for, and I'll meet you there. I won't push, won't assume. What if I don't know yet what I'm ready for? Then we wait until you do. There's no rush, Mara. We've got time. Do we? She glanced at him. We're not young anymore, Emmett. We don't have decades to figure things out. Every day we wait is a day we don't get back. I know, but I won't hurry you. Won't pressure you into anything before you're sure. And if I'm never sure, if the past is too big, the hurt too deep, then we're business partners and friends, and that's more than I had any right to hope for when I came here. She didn't respond, just kept her eyes on the road ahead. But as the sun set and the temperature dropped, she moved slightly closer to him on the bench, her shoulder touching his, a small gesture but deliberate. He felt the warmth of the contact through their heavy coats and allowed himself to hope, carefully, that time and patience might eventually heal what his past choices had broken. That night, back at the cabin, Mara surprised him by producing something from a trunk. A bundle wrapped in fabric, tied with string. She set it on the table between them. I found this when I was going through Jacob's things after he died, she said. Didn't know what to make of it at the time, but after reading your letters, after everything, I think I understand now. Emmett untied the string and unfolded the fabric. Inside was a partially completed quilt, the squares pieced together in a pattern that told a story. He recognized fabric from his old shirts, ones he'd left behind when he went to war. Scraps from Mara's wedding dress, cream-colored with small blue flowers. Pieces of what looked like Jacob's work clothes, sturdy brown and grey cloth worn soft by labor. Jacob started it, Mara said, the year before he died. I found it in his workshop, hidden away. He never mentioned it, never showed it to me. But he was piecing together a quilt from all of us, you, me, him, like he was trying to make something beautiful from all the broken pieces. Emmett ran his fingers over the careful stitching. The work was rough but sincere, the stitches of someone learning a craft not natural to them. Why would he do this? I think he knew. That you might come back someday. That we might need a way to understand how to fit all these pieces together. The past and the present, the choices made and the chances lost. He was giving us a pattern, maybe, showing us it's possible to take scraps of different lives and sew them into something new. He was a wise man. He was practical. saw problems and tried to solve them, even problems that might come up after he was gone. She touched one of the squares gently. I've been working on it since you arrived, adding pieces, finishing what he started. Thought maybe, if things worked out, we could use it. A reminder that we don't have to throw away the past to build a future. We just have to figure out how the pieces fit. Emmett looked at the quilt, then at Mara. What are you saying? I'm saying I'm tired of being angry. Tired of holding on to hurt, even justified hurt. You made a mistake with the land. You'll probably make more mistakes because you're human and you're learning. But I'm willing to work through it if you are. Willing to keep trying to build something from all these scraps and pieces. I want that. More than anything. Then we keep going. Day by day, choice by choice. We work the land together. We make decisions together. We finish this quilt together. And we see what emerges. She stood and moved to the stove, pouring coffee for them both. When she handed him his cup, her fingers lingered on his for just a moment longer than necessary. I'm not ready for everything yet, she said. Can't promise when I will be, or even if. The past still hurts, Emmett, and trust takes time to rebuild, especially when it was broken so thoroughly. I understand, but I'm not sending you to the Swenson house either. You'll stay in the barn for now, and we'll see how things develop. Fair enough? More than fair. As February turned toward March, they settled into a new rhythm. The work continued, but now with clear partnership. They made decisions together, consulted on everything from which cattle to sell to how to structure the spring planting. Emmett learned to ask before acting, to present options rather than solutions, to respect Mara's judgment as equal to his own. The quilt grew slowly, both of them working on it in the evenings. Emmett's stitches were clumsy compared to Mara's, but she showed him patiently how to make them smaller, more even. They didn't talk much while sewing. The work itself seemed to serve as conversation. The needle and thread saying things words couldn't quite capture. One evening, as they sat by lamplight working on opposite sides of the quilt, Mara asked, "What do you think happens in April? When the bank payment comes due?" They'd been avoiding the question, focusing on the daily work of winter. But April was approaching, and with it the moment of truth. "We'll make it," Emmett said. "Between the two properties, we've got enough cattle to sell. The prices won't be great, but they'll be better than winter rates. We'll make it work, and if we can't, then we'll figure something else out together. That's what partners do." She smiled, small but genuine. Together. I'm still getting used to that word. Having someone to share the burden with. It works both ways. You're carrying some of mine too. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what makes it work. When both people are strong enough to carry their own weight, but willing to help with the others when needed. Jacob was smart to start this quilt, Emmett said, studying the pattern emerging from their work. He understood something I'm just learning, that you don't have to erase the past to move forward. You just have to find a way to incorporate it into something new. He did understand that. Better than either of us did at the time. March brought the first hints of thaw, longer days, sun with actual warmth, the sound of water running under ice. The cattle grew restless, sensing the change in season. Emmett and Mara walked the combined property lines, planning where to reinforce fencing, where to expand pasture. The work ahead was daunting. 2 properties meant twice the maintenance, twice the responsibility. But it also meant twice the potential, twice the resources, standing on a rise that overlooked both homesteads, watching the sun set over land that now belonged to both of them. Emmett felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Not happiness exactly, that seemed too simple a word. But contentment, maybe. Purpose. The sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Mara stood beside him, her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill. "We're going to make this work," she said. Not a question, but a statement of intent. "Yes," Emmett agreed. "We are." The quilt was nearly finished now, just a few more squares to add, a border to complete. When done, it would tell the story of 3 people and the choices they'd made, some right, some wrong, all leading to this moment, this place. This possibility of building something new from the pieces of what had been. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 21, riding off to war with dreams of quick glory and uncomplicated homecoming. But it was real, and it was earned, and it was his, theirs, built from honesty and hard work and the daily choice to keep trying, keep hoping, keep trusting that the future could be different from the past if they were willing to do the work to make it so. April arrived with all the chaos spring brings to the plains. Mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels, calves being born in the cold hours before dawn, fence posts heaving out of ground as frost worked its way deeper before finally releasing. The work became relentless, both of them up before light and working past dark, driven by the deadline they could no longer ignore. The bank payment was due on April 15th. They had 12 days. Emmett and Mara spent an evening doing the final calculations. They'd selected the cattle to sell, 8 head of mixed stock, the best they could spare without gutting their breeding program. Thomas Caldwell had agreed to buy 3 at a fair price, a gesture that seemed equal parts neighborly kindness and lingering hope that Mara might yet choose differently. The remaining 5 they'd take to the cattle buyer in town, hoping for decent rates. "If we get $15 a head for the ones going to town, we'll have enough," Mara said, running her finger down the column of numbers. "But cattle prices have been soft. Might only get 12, maybe 13. Then we sell something else. The wagon, tools, whatever it takes. The wagon is how we get to town. The tools are how we work the land. There's not much left to sell that won't cripple our ability to keep going." Emmett looked at the figures, at the gap between what they had and what they needed. $60 short if the cattle prices came in low. $60 that might as well be $600 for all their ability to conjure it from thin air. "I'll figure something out," he said. "We'll figure something out. Together, remember? Together." But that night, lying in the barn, Emmett couldn't sleep. He kept running through options, each more desperate than the last. He could try to find work in town, but that would take him away from the farm when they needed every hand for spring work. Could try to borrow from neighbors, but that was just trading one debt for another. Could sell Jacob's tools, but they needed those to maintain the property. The forge they'd created together sat cooling in the corner, a simple setup, but functional. They'd made it to create the new brand, the symbol of their partnership. A wild rose intertwined with a star, burned into leather and eventually into cattle hide. The brand iron itself was their first joint creation, hammered out over hours of work, each of them taking turns at the anvil. He thought about that brand, about what it represented. 2 separate elements made into one unified whole. It had seemed symbolic when they made it, romantic even. But now, facing the hard reality of numbers that didn't add up, he wondered if it had been foolish to think symbols mattered when the material world was so unforgiving. Morning came too soon. They loaded the 8 cattle into the holding pen near the road, ready for the buyers. Thomas Caldwell arrived first, his wagon rattling up in the early light. He examined the 3 he'd agreed to purchase, nodded his approval, and counted out $45, 15 per head. "A fair price, and maybe a bit generous. Appreciate you doing business with us," Mara said, pocketing the money. "We're neighbors," Thomas said. "That means something out here." He glanced at Emmett. "Means we help each other when we can." After Thomas left with his cattle, Emmett and Mara loaded the remaining 5 into their wagon for the trip to town. The cattle were restless, knowing something was different, and it took time to get them secured. By the time they were ready to leave, the morning was half gone. The trip to town took longer with loaded cattle, the wagon moving slowly over the muddy roads. They arrived at the cattle buyer's yard just after noon to find a dozen other farmers already waiting, all with the same idea: sell stock to make spring payments. The buyer, a hard-faced man named Morrison, walked through the waiting cattle with the air of someone who knew he had the advantage. "Market's soft," he announced to the gathered farmers. "Too much supply, not enough demand. I'm paying $10 a head, no exceptions. $10. Emmett felt his stomach drop. At that rate, their 5 cattle would bring $50, leaving them 65 short of what they needed. "That's robbery," one farmer protested. "These are good animals worth twice that." "Then take them somewhere else," Morrison said flatly. But you won't find better rates within 100 miles, and your payment dates won't wait for you to shop around. Emmett looked at Mara. She was doing the math in her head. He could see it, calculating and recalculating as if different arithmetic might yield different results. "We take it," she said quietly. "We don't have a choice." They completed the sale, receiving $50 that felt like mockery in Emmett's hand. With the $45 from Thomas, they had $95 total. The payment due was $160. They were $65 short. On the ride home, neither spoke much. The reality of failure sat between them, heavy and undeniable. They'd worked hard, made smart decisions, done everything right. And it hadn't been enough. Sometimes it just wasn't enough. "We could ask for an extension," Mara said finally. "Go to the bank, explain the situation. They might give us another month." "Might, or might foreclose anyway. Banks aren't known for mercy." "Then what do we do, Emmett?" "I'm out of ideas." He didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. For all his intentions, all his efforts to be useful and present and partner-like, he'd failed at the one thing that mattered most, keeping her safe from losing everything. They were 2 days from the deadline when Emmett made his decision. He didn't tell Mara what he planned because he knew she'd try to stop him, and maybe she'd be right to. But sometimes a man had to act on conviction rather than consensus, had to trust his gut even when his gut had led him wrong before. He left before dawn, walking the 3 miles to the Caldwell place. Tom answered the door, surprise evident on his face at finding Emmett there so early. "Need to talk to you," Emmett said. "Business matter." They sat at the Caldwell kitchen table, Tom's wife Sarah providing coffee before making herself scarce. Emmett laid out his situation plainly. They were short, the deadline was close, and he had one thing of value left to offer. "I know how to run cattle," he said. "Spent 30 years doing it before I came here. I'm older now, slower, but I still know the work. I'm offering you a year of my labor, full-time, in exchange for $65 now." Tom studied him over his coffee cup. "That's selling yourself cheap. A good drover makes more than that in a season. I'm not asking for what I'm worth. I'm asking for what I need." "And Mara? She know you're here making this offer?" "She will, after the fact. So you're doing that thing again, making decisions without her. Thought you'd learn better." Emmett took a breath. "I'm making a decision about my labor, my time. That's mine to offer. The money goes to our shared debt, but the work is mine to give. Semantic difference. Maybe, but it's the difference I can live with. I won't let her lose that land because I couldn't figure out how to bridge a $65 gap." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "Let me talk to Sarah. This affects her too. Having you working here means Thomas won't have as much help from me. Redistributes the labor." Sarah was called back in, and the 3 of them talked through the practicalities. When could Emmett start? What would the work entail? How would they structure it so both farms got what they needed? It took an hour of negotiation, but they reached an agreement. Emmett would work for the Caldwells from sunup to noon each day, then return to help Mara with afternoon and evening chores. It would be exhausting, but it was possible. Tom counted out $65 in cash and gold, the coins heavy in Emmett's hand. "Don't make me regret this," Tom said. "And don't make Mara regret trusting you." "I won't." Walking back to the homestead, Emmett felt the weight of what he'd done. It wasn't the same as buying land without consultation. This was his labor, his choice about how to spend his time. But it would affect Mara, would mean less of him available for their shared work. He'd made a unilateral decision again, just dressed in different clothes. He found her in the barn, mucking out stalls. When he held out the money, her eyes went wide. "Where did you get that?" "Sold a year of my labor to the Caldwells. I'll work mornings there, afternoons and evenings here. It's enough to make the payment." Her face went through several expressions: relief, anger, confusion. "You sold a year of your time without asking me." "I sold my labor. That's mine to give. Your labor that I need here. Your time that affects our work." "Emmett, how is this different from the land?" "Because it's temporary. A year, then it's done. And it's the only option I could find that doesn't require us to sell things we need or go into more debt." She set down the pitchfork, her hands shaking slightly. "Do you understand what you've done? You've bound yourself to work for a man whose son wants what you have. You've put yourself in a position where you'll be exhausted, spread thin, unable to fully engage with either obligation. And you did it without talking to me first. What was I supposed to do? Let you lose everything because I couldn't figure out a better solution? You were supposed to come to me. We were supposed to figure it out together. Maybe there was another way, maybe not, but we should have looked together. There wasn't time. There's always time to ask, always time to consult. That's what partnership means, Emmett. Not making grand gestures to save the day, but working through problems together, even when the solutions are uncomfortable. He stood there holding the money that had seemed like salvation 5 minutes ago, and now felt like another mistake. I was trying to help, I know, but help that comes without consent, without consultation, isn't really help. It's control dressed up as sacrifice. So what do I do? Give the money back? Let the bank take the property? Mara was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was tired. No, we take the money. We make the payment. We keep the land. But we also acknowledge that you made another unilateral decision, and that pattern has to stop. This is the last time, Emmett, the absolute last time. If you can't learn to include me in decisions, then we can't be partners. We can be business associates who share property, but that's all. I don't want that. Then prove it. For the next year while you're working off this debt, you ask me before making any decision that affects us both. You run things by me. You treat me like an equal partner in every sense. Can you do that? I can try. Trying isn't enough anymore. You do it, or we're done. Not just romantically. I mean done as partners, as people trying to build something together. I'll buy out your half of the property if I have to, or you can buy out mine. But I won't keep doing this dance where you save the day, and I'm supposed to be grateful for decisions I never got to make. The ultimatum was clear. Change or lose everything that mattered. Not the land, not the money, but her. The possibility of them. I'll do it, he said. Not try, do. I'll learn to ask first, act second. I'll learn to trust that we're stronger together than I am alone. Then we go to the bank. We make the payment. We save the farm. And then we start over, with better understanding this time. They rode to town in silence, made the payment, received the stamped receipt that meant they still had a home. Walking out of the bank, Emmett felt hollowed out, but also strangely lighter. He'd bought them time, a year, maybe more. Time to prove he could change, could be the partner she needed instead of the hero nobody asked for. On the ride home, Mara finally spoke. Thank you for finding a solution, even if I hate how you found it. You're welcome, even though I know I did it wrong. Learning curve, steep one. Most worthwhile things are. She glanced at him. We're going to be all right, aren't we? Eventually? I hope so. I'm going to work like hell to make sure we are. Work's the easy part. The hard part is the daily choice to do right by each other. Then I'll make that choice. Every day. For however long it takes. She didn't respond, but her hand moved to cover his on the wagon seat just for a moment. A small gesture, but he felt the promise in it that despite his failures, despite the missteps, she was still willing to believe in possibility. Still willing to hope that two broken people could figure out how to build something whole. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made winter seem like a fever dream. The sky stretched blue and endless, and the prairie grass grew tall enough to brush against a horse's belly. The combined farms thrived under careful management, calves born healthy, crops coming in strong, the land responding to attention and partnership. Emmett kept his word to the Caldwells, working mornings there with the dedication of a man trying to prove something. Tom treated him fairly, never mentioning the circumstances that had brought them to their arrangement. Thomas, for his part, had grown distant but polite, finally accepting that some doors had closed to him. The afternoons and evenings Emmett spent on the homestead with Mara, and slowly, incrementally, they learned the language of partnership. He asked before acting. She included him in decisions. They argued sometimes, real arguments where both voices mattered, but they also laughed more. found rhythm in their work that felt natural, earned. The quilt was finished in June, spread across Mara's bed in the cabin. It told its story in fabric and thread. 3 lives woven together, the bright patches and the dark ones, the careful stitches and the clumsy ones, all of it making something beautiful and functional from what had seemed like just scraps. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mara asked, "When your year with the Caldwells is up, what do you want to do?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, will you still sleep in the barn? Keep this distance between us? Or will you move into the cabin? Properly, I mean." As more than just a business partner, Emmett's heart hammered against his ribs. They'd been dancing around this question for months, both aware of the growing closeness, but neither willing to name it directly. "What do you want?" he asked carefully. "I asked you first." "Fair enough." He took a breath. "I want to move into the cabin, want to marry you if you'll have me, want to build a life that isn't divided into yours and mine but becomes ours. But only if that's what you want. Only if you're ready." Mara was quiet, rocking slowly, her eyes on the horizon, where the sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I loved Jacob," she said finally. "Loved him true and steady, and I don't regret a day of it. But what I felt for him, and what I feel for you, they're different kinds of love. His was comfortable, safe, built on present reality. Yours is," she paused, searching for words, "built on history and hope both. It's more complicated, more fraught, but also deeper somehow. Like roots that go down to bedrock. I don't need you to forget Jacob. Don't want you to. I know. That's part of why this might work. You understand that I'm not choosing between you and his memory. I'm choosing to add something new to what I already carry." She looked at him directly. "So yes, when the year is up, you move into the cabin. We marry if that's what you want. We build something together that honors what was while creating what will be. Are you sure? As sure as anyone can be about the future. We'll make mistakes. You'll probably do something unilaterally again at some point because old patterns die hard. But we'll work through it, because that's what people do when they choose to stay. I choose to stay. Then that's settled." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on land that belonged to both of them now, legally, practically, spiritually. The barn was solid, the fences mended, the future secured as much as anyone could secure such a thing. The months that followed brought them fully into partnership. Emmett learned to catch himself when the old instincts rose, to ask instead of assume, to wait for Mara's input before deciding. It wasn't always easy, but it got easier, the way any skill improves with practice. They married in September, a quiet ceremony at the same church where Mara had married Jacob. Some people in town raised eyebrows, thought it too soon or inappropriate. Others understood that life was short and uncertain, and judging how people chose to live, it was a fool's errand. Emmett and Mara didn't care much either way. They'd learned that other people's opinions couldn't build a life or break one. Only their own choices could do that. The year turned, and the debt to the Caldwells was paid. Tom shook Emmett's hand on the last day and said simply, "You're a man of your word. That counts for something." Winter came again, but this time Emmett slept in the cabin, in the bed they now shared, under the quilt that told their story. The cold was just as bitter, the work just as hard, but he faced it with someone beside him. That made all the difference. Years passed, not many, but enough. They adopted 2 children from an orphan train that passed through, a brother and sister who'd lost their parents to fever. Gave them home and name and the kind of stability that came from land, worked by people who understood its value. The children grew strong on prairie air and steady love, learning to mend fence and birth calves and understand that family was something you built, not just something you were born into. Emmett's hair went fully white, and his back ached more mornings than not. Mara's hands showed the signs of hard work, the knuckles knotted with arthritis, but strong still. They were old before their time, the way frontier life aged people, but they were together. That was what mattered. On a morning in early spring, some indeterminate number of years after that first desperate approach to Mara's door, Emmett stood on the porch of the cabin with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over land that had become home. The milk pail, that original empty vessel that had brought him here, sat nearby, full now, daily evidence of abundance rather than need. The children's voices carried from the barn where they were doing morning chores. Mara was inside, cooking breakfast, humming something tuneless, but content. Some mistakes we carry for a lifetime, Emmett thought. Some chances we thought were lost forever, but sometimes, if we're blessed and brave enough, we get to set down the weight and pick up something better. Not a second chance at what was, but a first chance at what can be. Mara came out onto the porch, slipping her arm through his. She'd done this countless times now, the gesture automatic and easy. He squeezed her hand, the one that bore his ring now alongside the one she wore on the chain around her neck. Both marriages, both loves, both honored. Coffee's getting cold, she said. It'll warm up. That's not how coffee works. It's how life works, though. Sometimes things cool down, then warm up again when conditions change. She smiled, understanding his meaning. You're getting philosophical in your old age. Someone has to be. They stood together, watching the light spread across the prairie. Two people who'd taken the long way around to find their way home. The land stretched before them, demanding and beautiful, requiring constant work and attention. But they were equal to it now, together. Partners in every sense that mattered. The children emerged from the barn, arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Mara called them to breakfast, her voice carrying authority and affection in equal measure. Emmett followed them inside, into warmth and noise, and the daily miracle of ordinary life. The milk pail sat on the porch, catching morning light. Empty when he'd arrived, full now with the milk of their shared labor. A symbol, if one was needed, of what could be built from honest work and hard-won trust. Of what became possible when two people chose each other, day after day. Through mistakes and grace and the slow accumulation of moments that became a life, he'd come to her door, begging, shame in his eyes and nothing in his hands but need. She'd given him milk, and more than milk. She'd given him the chance to become the man he'd failed to be before. Given him partnership, purpose, redemption earned through daily choice rather than grand gesture. And that, he thought as he sat down to breakfast with his family, was the best gift anyone had ever given him. Better than forgiveness, better than absolution. The gift of being allowed to stay, to try, to build something new from the wreckage of what had been. The gift of home, finally, after so many years of wandering. Outside, the prairie wind blew soft and warm, carrying the smell of growing things. The cattle lowed contentedly in their pastures. The land, worked with care and respect, yielded its bounty. And in the cabin, 5 people who'd found each other against odds and circumstance sat down to break bread together, grateful for the day and the chance to live it fully, together, without pretense or performance. Just life, honest and hard and holy in its simple persistence. Some mistakes we carry for a lifetime, some chances we thought were lost forever. But sometimes, when we're brave enough to ask and humble enough to accept, we get to come home. Not to what was,